Hello everyone. In today's episode we will be making a serving platter out of a small little pallet here. So if you're curious about where to find these at, I actually got this one behind a city market, and or Safeway is another place here in the good old Colorado area. Any kind of Kroger or just any food store in general. A lot of times they'll ship in a large cooler or freezer or some kind of new mod or display for the store, and it won't quite fit on a pallet, and it'll kind of be looking like it's going to tip over in the truck for transit, so they'll throw one of these under that little extra leg. So these do come up. They're kind of a rarity. It's only in shipments that need such, and then they usually just get kind of put behind the store. And if you ask any of the associates and or managers that are near the back door, 9 times out of 10 they don't carry it. They'll let you have it. Now, if you go up behind the store after hours and pick the pallet up without asking anyone, usually they track you down your license plate, and that is not good. So just always keep in mind, make sure that you ask first. We've had a few different areas here in town even. I'm a vendor, so talking to a couple of receivers, they do report people for doing such, so keep that in mind. If you're looking for pallets, just be willing to hear no and ask. There are a lot of ones that they pay for. Now, depending on what associate you ask, they won't always know which one, so they'll just kind of broadly say all pallets. But any of the ones that are spray painted red or blue are either Chet brand or Petco brand. Those ones are rented from a company, and that company that is renting them is usually the one that has them behind them for pickup. And those ones are usually chemically treated. Just fair note, a lot of pallets, in fact it is now illegal since 2010 to chemical a pallet, but a lot of those pallets are constantly in flux, constantly getting rented, so more than likely those pallets are before 2010. They're that old. So they're not really worth it for how old and beat up they are. They constantly get renewed and refreshed with extra 2x4s and stuff, so just a side note. Don't pick up any of the ones that look spray painted. It's usually either going to be property of some other company and it'll say it on it, or that'll be wore off. And also it's just really hard to work with that wood, especially if it is chemically treated. Chemically treated wood is just a pain to work with. It dulls blades faster, smells terrible, and it's a horrible fume that is noxious that you should not breathe in. It's like working with galvanized steel and trying to cut it. It's very harmful for you, very not good. So, side notes aside, this little pallet here, we're just going to remove the slats. It's a very simple process here, and one of the kind of fun, first getting into pallet wood projects kind of thing, because all we'll really need for this is a cutting source of some kind and a hammer. It's pretty simple and straightforward. Any kind of puller or anything that you would have for a pallet as well. So I've got the Crescent brand little puller that I got, the bull bar, as well as I have my larger yellow bar, and I have just normal hammers and a couple of different things to pop these apart. So all we're going to do in this process is pop off all the boards, get our two little 2x4 stringers, and then we will go through each side and make a cut, 2 cuts, and we will utilize this middle section here that would be for a forklift. We're going to utilize that as the handle. So it's not too difficult, but it's a fun little project. A lot of sanding too. This pallet is a lot more on the furry side and a lot more of the kind of rough lumber. So I'm going to go take all the boards off and then sand it all smooth, and then I'm going to cut both ends to the approximate dimension of each other. I'm going to kind of get an approximate dimension on one and line it up on the other and make that same transition mark. So it doesn't have to be super perfect. A little off is kind of eclectic and cute. Highly off is very irregular and not looking good. So just kind of keep that in mind. Rules of thirds and whatnot. So without further ado, we're going to pop over to a time lapse, take all the slats off, make a couple cuts. So I will do that, and then I will see you here in just a second. Alright, so everything has been disassembled now, and we are left with our two little stringers here. I'm going to make my line out, or my outline for these, and make a few cuts on them. That'll determine what or how many of these I will need. What we can do to kind of get an idea on that is we will lay out a couple of these boards. Thinking I can get away with 3. So 3 of these boards for the bottom, and a couple of them actually ended up getting some splits off. So from about here, pretty well down the board. A few of these are kind of either useless to an extent, or you can actually make that cut and then just have that tinier plank to work with. So primarily we want, of course, our 3 bottom, but we also would like potentially 2 on the sides. Now this project is intended for somebody who doesn't necessarily have access to anything more than like a hammer and a saw of some kind. So cutting these down is optional, but preferred, of course, because all of that gap in between, when we bring the boards in, we'll now have all this excess on the ends that we're going to want to cut. So for me, I'm going to use a chop saw, but any sawing method will work. If you have a bandsaw, chop saw, table saw, or if you just have a hand saw of like any variety, even like a honing saw will work perfectly fine. And it's just time, just keep your eye on the line, and make your cut. That's all that matters. Is if it's as straight as you can make it and then do a little bit of sanding at the end, you're golden. A little bit off, eclectic. A lot off, something's off. So kind of keep that in mind. I'm going to make sure to sand everything first because I know it's going to shrink my dimension a little bit and get the material a lot softer and a lot more enjoyable to use and work with. Like I said, this is a lot more furry or just kind of rough cut and rough sawn. So I'm going to kind of take that down a bit, put on my little respirator mask and my goggles, and make sure to, or glasses, and make sure this is all nice and smooth. So you can watch that here in the next little time-lapse clip. Alrighty, so you'll just see my hands here, but I'll kind of go over what I'm planning on doing here. So far, I kind of just determined that 3 boards would be best width. And then as for the length, a few of these boards had, as you'd seen in the time-lapse, split. So what I ended up doing was just cutting them as close to the splits and still leaving a little bit on. Kind of added some character, which is nice. I did the 3 for the bottom, I did 2 for the sides, the exact same length, whatever that ends up being. For me, on this little pallet, my total length is 16 inches. Wow, I just guessed that, and it is on the money. 16 inches. That's pretty awesome. For absolutely not touching a measuring tape this entire time. Anyway. So once you have your sides and your 3 for the bottom cut, I just took the remaining board and cut 2 lengths that are the same as the width. It can be a little less, can be a little more. Like I said, kind of the nice eclecticness of this is just being speedy and getting it all put together, but still leaving a little bit of imperfection just to kind of have that same kind of cuteness or kind of charm to it. So now what I'm going to do is leave these 2 bottoms for the strength and structure to make this essentially a board. So these 3 are going to get glued and pin nailed to these 2. So these are going to lay on top of these. going across, get glued and pin nailed, and then this will be a board. Then what I'm going to do is take these two sides and I'm going to mount them to the handles, and I'm going to mount it on the top part. So on this I did a light sanding, so whichever side you feel you want to be the top, kind of like this little bit of character here, a little bit of like a chocolate swirl in there. So I'm going to take and mount this more towards the top there. And this will look kind of like an old milk crate, something kind of antique-y, but I'm going to glue and pin nail that in on both sides to where I have a top section and a flat board, and then I'm going to just flat mount this to that board, running glue and pin nail every so often, probably do 3 or 5. Seems to be about on par, at least one in either end, one in the dead center, and then split the difference and glue it. The glue is going to be the actual strength and structure behind this. The pin nails is just to give the final result and some mild strength until the glue holds. So that way I don't actually have to go through and put bracer blocks and clamp the whole thing down. I can just go through the whole process beginning to end and have a finished result here by the end of it. So now I'm going to go through. I'm just using Tight Bond 2. This is good for mild water resistance and indirect food contact. So if you did have some kind of like, this is to be more of a fruit basket, so you had some oranges, pears, apples, pineapples, what have you, in this for display, that's perfectly fine. If you were to be even using this as a display cutting board or like a charcuterie board for a cheese spread or anything at all like that for a wine or cocktail party or something like that, this can still, as long as you trust the wood that you used and it doesn't look like it's been soaked in oil or just drudged through something, you can also seal the wood using some beeswax. Same kind of thing that I did for the other charcuterie board. If you're going that route, we'll seal it so that way you're not having any of that kind of food soak in or any splinters from the wood go into your food as well. So without further ado, I will go through the process of gluing everything up and pin nailing it together. So stay tuned. Hopefully you've enjoyed my take on kind of one of the more, I guess, traditional first builds that a lot of people have, which is like a serving platter or serving tray. This was something I was kind of going off the basis of premise of if you were to be starting out and you had a saw of some kind to cut the wood, and pretty much everyone has a hammer, some kind of claw hammer or something like that. I ended up using a little breaker bar or pry bar to help out a bit because a few of the boards were a lot more on the thin kind of super flimsy pine side for my particular pallet. So I ended up needing a little extra help. All that aside, I ended up using a sander, of course, as one of the tools I kind of forgot to mention. My personal preference was just because the pallet I had a lot of like kind of hairs almost on it, kind of a furry looking rough cut. So If you're able to find the right pallet, you won't necessarily need to do that if you're looking for that more rustic look too, and if this is going to be more of a showpiece rather than something that'll be for use. For me personally, this can end up being used for a lot of things now. I ended up using the same butcher block conditioner that I used on the prior charcuterie board video, and it is an amazing product and it is food safe. The wood glue, like I said, is for intermittent use with food, not consistent, something that you would store in the refrigerator by any means. Not that you would necessarily store a wooden bowl in a refrigerator. But all that to say, if you were to serve food on it for an hour or two or even a couple hours and just have like a cheese platter out there, this is more than adequate. Perfectly fine intermittent use, no problems there. If it's something that is like a cutting board that you're going to consistently use every single time that you pull it out, and it's going to have food on it for hours and hours, or just multiple pieces of food, it can lightly absorb that. So that's where this is something you definitely want to clean. But a lot of these are going to be showpieces more than they are going to be consistent, like throw in the dishwasher every day or every night use items. And if you're using a display tray in that regard, you just be wiping it down at the end. So this will work out perfectly for that. Little eclectic, little different. The main reasons I ended up not leaving on more of the 2x4 was that there was just kind of a limit with the material I was working with, and I ended up sanding down the kind of drop down on the 2x4s just because it made it look a little bit better, since I couldn't get that exactly in between the two to make it look very nice and meant to be. You can potentially, you can also leave on a little bit more of the 2x4 or do it off to the sides if you're going to have your hands more kind of on one end of it being a serving tray. You just want the grips kind of off to the side rather than the dead center. Another rendition that people will do is that they'll take the 2x4 and leave it up with the downward cut, and then they'll actually purchase hardware to put with it. This was more meant to be usable, still kind of stylish, kind of had that little bit of a country home theme or rustic appeal to it, without any additional purchasing of any equipment. So let's say you're getting into the craft and you have no hammer, you have no circular saw, table saw, or chop saw or anything, and you just purchased a hand saw. This is something that you can definitely knock out. I use brad nails as well and glue just because it's my personal preference. It leaves a nice look and aesthetic, and I can trust the strength of the wood, or the glue. You can use just glue and the nails that came out of the pallet to reuse in the pallet. I should try doing that. I suggest it a lot. It's just one of those things that a lot of the videos I end up making are either gifts or things I want to use around my own house, and you can get away with that, but it's not necessarily my aesthetic and appeal. That's my bias for sure in my videos, and I apologize for that. But hopefully you enjoyed. If you have, make sure to hit that like button, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Hopefully this is something that gets a taste for what my channel is, and hopefully you want more. Hit the bell if you haven't as well. That gives you notifications every time a video goes off. So if you've suddenly seen that I have 3 videos and you didn't realize it, you probably haven't hit the notification bell. It definitely helps you, and it helps me. Helps my channel get a little bit more recognition and kind of get into the mainstream a little bit more, so that way more people can view it, more people can enjoy it. So thank you very much for your time and for watching the video. Have a good night.